to be less bullish, let's call it 0. And this one you expect to be even less bullish, possibly bearish. But it doesn't have to be bearish, but it does have to be less bullish. Okay, so now that we've started exploring the numbers that are happening behind the scenes with Sentient Trader, and this is how Sentient Trader works out what it is expecting next. It's one of the ways it does it. But now you know to do it yourself. Okay, so let's have a look at the next 18-month cycle. What is the bullishness that we expect? Well, we expect it to be less than 62%. Now, you might ask me, is there a simple progression? The first cycle was 83%. The next cycle was 62%. Do we then expect the next cycle to be 41%, which is a simple arithmetic progression? Unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. I wish I could say, yes, we do, but it is not as simple as that. But as a very, very rough rule of thumb, yes, we could probably expect it to be, we certainly expect it to be less bullish. Okay, so it's going to be less than 62%. Will it be as bullish as 41%? I don't know. Okay, what I have done here is I have used Microsoft Excel's goal-seeking method to work out where the peak would need to occur if this had a score of about 46%. Okay, and why am I saying 46%? Well, because I expect it to be less bullish than 62, but I'm not going to go quite as bearish as 41. So I simply chose a very, very simple rough figure of 46%. So I want that to be 46%, and sorry, I want to change cell B22, and I want to change cell B20. Okay, I do a goal seek, and it has found a solution, and the bar that, according to that very simple calculation, the bar that the peak of the current 18-month cycle should occur on, as you can see there, is bar number 4673.54. Okay, let's just go back to our chart, and let's switch back to daily. Let's zoom in. Let's find bar 46, I've now forgotten it, 4673.54. Let's find bar 4674. Okay, and I click and I look at the bar number at the far left hand side. The bar 4674 is where the trough will occur. That's trough number 2. 4674, according to that very simple calculation, if the trough occurs on the 19th of October this year, then we will have seen a 46% 18-month cycle shape unfold. Do we expect a 46% 18-month cycle? I think it is not out of the question. I think it's very possible. So already I'm projecting forward towards the end of October, and dates in October probably make most traders tremble in their toes, but I'm projecting forward to a trough in October already, purely on the basis of that very simple calculation. Okay, I'm certainly not going to make any trades on the basis of it, but I'm hoping to show you some of the numbers behind the way in which these cycle shapes work. I see a comment from Tom. Pattern confirming everything you're saying. SPY, head and shoulders top, neckline broken, falls into inverted headline shoulders. Wow, this is complicated for a Wednesday afternoon, which is playing out just as a bearish ascending wedge. Neckline 137.63. Head and shoulders top, extremely bearish setup. Okay, yes, okay, so what Tom is saying is that the little calculation that I've just performed is pretty much in tune with. It confirms so many other projections in terms of where we expect price to go. And Mark has asked if I can explain how I get the percentages. Yes, I will. I'll explain that in a moment. In fact, if you don't mind, Mark, I'm going to come back to it because there's something else very important that I want to do, and it's actually already time for me to wrap up. There's something extremely important that I must get to in terms of this calculation that I've done. All I've done so far is I've looked at the 18-month cycles. Now, you know that within each 18-month cycle, there are 2 40-week cycles. Okay? So, what is of great interest to me, because I am a little obsessed with cycle shapes, what's of great interest to me is how the shapes of the sub-cycles relate to the shapes of the longer cycles. And let's have a look at, I see a comment from Jose, I'll get to it in a moment, but let's get back to the numbers, and I will show you a really fascinating, for me, really interesting thing, and that is how the sub-shapes, or at least what I call the sub-shapes, but they are the shapes of the sub-cycles. Do you all understand what that means? In an 18-month cycle, you have got 2 40-week cycles, okay? How do the shapes of the 2 40-week cycles manifest themselves? Okay, this is something that is extraordinary, and I hope that you will also agree that it is extraordinary. Here is the first 18-month cycle over here. Okay, here are my scores: 85%, average 83%. Okay. Now, to the right of that are the 2 40-week cycles. Here is the first 40-week cycle. Okay, that's the first. And here is the second 40-week cycle. What do we see happening in those 2 40-week cycles? Well, first of all, what do we expect? You always expect the 40-week cycle to be more bullish than the second 40-week cycle, okay? Why? Because I have already said today that the longer cycles are aging, so your underlying trend always decays, it always gets worse. So you always expect to see the first sub-cycle have a greater bullish score. What is the bullish score for the first 40-week cycle? And I won't go through all the calculations, I'll show you in a moment how you can do it. But the first 40-week cycle had a 93% bullish score. Okay? And I see Steve with a question. I'll get there in a moment, Steve. Let me just finish the sentence. So the first 40-week cycle had a 93% average bullish score. It was a very bullish cycle. 93% is pretty bullish. Okay. The second 40-week cycle had an average 58% bullish score. Okay. Is that what we expect to see? Yes. Remember, the second cycle always has to be less bullish than the previous cycle. Okay? Now, let me show you something else extraordinary. When we average the bullish scores of those 2 40-week cycles, we get this row here. Can you see row 7? Average of the sub-cycles. The average of the sub-cycles here was 83% on the first average and 68% on the second average. Do you notice something? The average of the sub-cycles is very close to the average of the full cycle, the 18-month cycle. Okay? And there's a really exciting point that I'm going to make eventually. I'm going to get there within the next few minutes. Okay. So that's the first 18-month cycle. Let's look at the second 18-month cycle. Second 18-month, as we've already seen, had an overall bullishness score of 62%. Okay? It was lower than the overall bullishness of the first 18-month cycle. What about the two 40-week cycles that 18-month cycle were broken down into? The first 40-week cycle had a score of 87%. Okay, that's a very bullish cycle. What about the second 40-week cycle? That had a horribly bearish shape. So again, everything is working perfectly as expected. Okay, remember the second 40-week cycle, the second any cycle, must have a less bullish shape than the previous one. Always. It must be. Okay, so in this case, it had an average of only 5% bullishness, which is a very bearish cycle, in fact. Now, what happened when we averaged those 2 40-week cycles? Can you see the average of the sub-cycles here? The average of those sub-cycles came out at 56% and 36%. Do you notice something else? That is very close to the actual score of the 18-month cycle. Okay? So there is a tool here that we can use to project what's going to happen next. Sentient Trader uses it. Because we know that the numbers must make sense. Unless, and here's the very big disclaimer, unless your analysis is wrong. Okay? If your analysis is a good analysis, then these numbers will work and they will make sense. If these numbers don't work, then your analysis might be faulty. people often say to me, or they have been saying to me recently with version 3 of the software, I can't pin that trough. I cannot get Sentient Trader to put that trough there. Okay, when Sentient Trader performs its analysis, it's doing a huge number of very complex calculations, and one of those calculations is a simple calculation that I've just demonstrated to you today. Okay, and if the numbers don't make sense, then Sentient Trader will be very reluctant to position a trough somewhere. Okay, so how can we use these numbers to project what's going to happen next? Okay, well, the first thing that we can do is we can say we are already fairly far advanced in our current 18-month cycle, as you can see. Okay, here is the third 18-month cycle. We're far advanced in it. For various reasons, I believe a peak might have already occurred in this particular 18-month cycle. I won't bore you with all the details, but I've calculated an imaginary score. It's not a final score yet because we have not positioned the final trough, but it's a score that it's a work in progress. Okay, and I think it will probably have a percentage of about 46%. Okay, the first 40-week cycle completed, as you know, I believe, on the 4th of June. Okay, so we had a score. How bullish was that 40-week cycle? It was, as you can see, 75% on average bullish. Okay, so what do we expect for the next 40-week cycle? And this is the punchline. At the end of this, I'm going to bring things to a close. I am going to answer those final few questions. But what do we expect from the next 40-week cycle? Well, you know, the second cycle will always be less bullish than the previous one. Okay, so therefore, I expect a cycle that is less than 75% bullish. Okay, that's the first thing. So I can say I expect it to be less than 75%. As this cycle unfolds, I am going to be calculating the bullishness of the cycle, and I'm going to be monitoring it very carefully. Okay, but what I can tell you already today is that I expect the average of the next 40-week cycle and the 40-week cycle that we've already seen, I expect that average to be roughly the same as the average of the 18-month cycle. In other words, about 47%, somewhere around there. Now, I've filled in the numbers, and you can see them here. I filled in the numbers in order to achieve that. In order to achieve an average, which will bring our 18-month average to about the right level, we must have a very bearish 40-week cycle. Is this definitely going to happen? No, not definitely, but it's a guideline. And believe me, it plays out more often than not. So it's very worth paying attention to this. So what are some of the numbers here? Well, the number that I would like to point out to you, and I've used the calculation to calculate these numbers, and I'll show you in a moment how I've done it. But the peak, in order to achieve a percentage figure of 23%, which we need in order to bring the 18-month total much lower, that peak needs to be on bar 4568. Let's just go back to our chart. This is the kind of I do with my charts all the time. Let's go back to that chart and let's figure out. So in other words, according to that calculation, the peak of the current 40-week cycle, which is the cycle that started